The glass shattered against the marble floor, but the silence that followed was even louder. 200 guests had gathered beneath the bright afternoon lights of the Grand Meridian Hotel to celebrate what was being called the business deal of the decade. Cameras were flashing, executives were smiling, and a massive screen behind the stage displayed the number everyone had come to admire, $1 billion. Then a young man in a simple charcoal suit stepped forward, and instead of welcoming him, 3 executives laughed. One of them lifted a glass and deliberately poured its contents over the man's shoulders. The room erupted with nervous laughter. Someone whispered that the poor outsider had wandered into the wrong event. Nobody knew that the quiet man standing there was the actual owner of the company behind the billion-dollar deal. Before we uncover what happened next, take a moment to like, comment, share, and subscribe to Kindness Corner 2.0 if you believe in kindness, second chances, and the idea that someone's appearance never tells you their true worth. His name was Elias Veyron, and at 34 years old, he had learned not to judge people by how they treated him when they thought he had nothing. He stood beneath the crystal lights with his dark brown hair neatly combed back, his charcoal suit slightly damp across the shoulders, and his expression completely calm. The man who had poured the wine on him was Gideon Harrow, the celebrated chief executive of Harrow Crest Industries, a powerful corporation that had spent months negotiating a partnership worth $1 billion. Gideon was surrounded by wealthy investors, famous entrepreneurs, lawyers, and journalists. He had expected Elias to be impressed by the invitation. Instead, he had been irritated by the young man's refusal to flatter him. Elias had arrived quietly because he wanted to observe the people who would soon become partners with his company. His company, Veyron Strategic Holdings, had acquired a controlling interest in the technology firm that possessed the patents Harrow Crest desperately needed. Elias rarely appeared publicly. He preferred working behind the scenes, protecting employees and studying every detail before making decisions. His modest appearance often caused people to underestimate him. He had intentionally worn an ordinary-looking suit because he wanted to know whether people respected a person before learning what was written on their bank statement. As Elias walked toward the reception area that afternoon, a nervous young event assistant named Mara Ellison accidentally bumped into him while carrying a stack of programs. The papers scattered across the floor. Several guests laughed, but Elias immediately crouched down and helped her gather them. Mara apologized repeatedly, worried that she would lose her job. Elias simply smiled and told her that everyone made mistakes and that she should not let one accident ruin her day. That small moment would later become one of the most important memories of the entire event. Across the room, Gideon noticed the interaction. He approached Elias with 2 senior executives beside him and asked whether he was one of the junior consultants. Elias politely explained that he was there representing the ownership group connected to the deal. Gideon smirked. To him, Elias looked too young and too ordinary to matter. One executive joked that perhaps the ownership group had sent an assistant because the real decision-makers were too busy to attend. Elias did not argue. He simply thanked them for their welcome and stepped aside. The ceremony began shortly afterward. Bright daylight poured through the enormous glass windows overlooking the city. The stage was decorated with white flowers and blue banners displaying the logos of both companies. The atmosphere was polished and expensive, but behind the smiles, Elias had noticed something troubling. Several financial documents on the presentation screen contained figures that did not match the versions his legal team had reviewed. A senior financial officer named Roland Mercer appeared unusually nervous whenever anyone mentioned the final contract. Elias quietly checked his phone. His attorney had already sent him a message confirming the discrepancy. Someone had attempted to alter the projected expenses before the signing ceremony. If the deal went through as presented, hundreds of millions could disappear through unnecessary contracts and inflated consulting fees. Elias realized that the problem was bigger than arrogance. Someone inside Harrow Crest had been preparing to manipulate the agreement. Yet he said nothing immediately. He wanted to see who would reveal themselves. During the reception, Gideon became increasingly confident. Surrounded by investors and cameras, he began speaking about how his leadership had supposedly transformed Harrow Crest into a global powerhouse. Then he noticed Elias standing quietly near the side of the room. Gideon walked toward him with a glass in his hand. In front of hundreds of people, he made a mocking comment about how some guests apparently did not understand the difference between attending a celebration and being important enough to stand near the stage. A few people laughed because they were afraid not to. Elias remained silent. Gideon then raised the glass and deliberately poured the wine across Elias's shoulders. The room froze. The liquid ran down Elias's charcoal jacket and onto the polished floor. A few guests looked away in embarrassment. Others watched with curiosity. Gideon expected anger, humiliation, perhaps even an apology for making him uncomfortable. Instead, Elias calmly picked up a fallen napkin and wiped his hands. Then he looked directly at Gideon and said that the event was supposed to celebrate a partnership built on respect, and he hoped everyone remembered that before the afternoon was over. Gideon laughed. He asked whether Elias was threatening him. Elias replied that he was doing nothing of the sort. Then he turned toward the stage. The company's chairman stepped toward the microphone and announced that there would be a brief change to the signing ceremony. Instead of beginning with the executive presentation, the legal ownership statement would be read first. Gideon's smile disappeared. The chairman looked toward Elias and asked him to join them on stage. For several seconds, nobody moved. Elias walked forward. The chairman introduced him as Elias Veyron, founder and principal owner of Veyron Strategic Holdings, the investment group that held the controlling rights to the technology patents at the center of the billion-dollar agreement. The room became completely silent. The same guests who had laughed moments earlier now stared at Elias. Gideon's face went pale. The chairman continued, explaining that without Elias's company, Harrow Crest could not legally complete the proposed acquisition. Elias was not an assistant, consultant, or junior representative. He was the person whose signature could make the entire billion-dollar agreement possible. And he had not signed. Gideon suddenly understood what the afternoon had become. But Elias was not finished. He asked the legal team to display the original financial documents beside the revised presentation. The differences appeared on the enormous screen. Inflated consulting fees. Unapproved expenses. Several suspicious transfers. The numbers were impossible to ignore. Roland Mercer began sweating. The chairman asked who had authorized the changes. Nobody answered. Then Elias quietly explained that his team had traced the altered figures to a private consulting company connected to Roland. The arrangement would have redirected a huge amount of the deal's money to people who had never been approved by either ownership group. The audience was stunned. Gideon turned toward Roland, demanding an explanation. Roland tried to deny everything, but the legal team produced signed records and digital verification showing exactly who had accessed the documents. The billion-dollar celebration had transformed into an investigation. Yet Elias did something unexpected. He did not demand revenge. He did not humiliate Gideon. Instead, he looked at the hundreds of people in the room and said that the problem was not simply one dishonest executive. The greater problem was a culture where people believed wealth gave them permission to disrespect others. If they wanted to build a billion-dollar company, they first needed to build a workplace where a young assistant, a cleaner, a receptionist, or a visitor could be treated with the same basic dignity as a millionaire. His words changed the atmosphere. Mara, the event assistant Elias had helped earlier, stood quietly near the back of the room with tears in her eyes. She had spent years watching executives ignore employees who worked behind the scenes. That afternoon, for the first time, someone powerful had publicly reminded everyone that respect belonged to everyone. Gideon approached Elias after the guests began leaving. The confidence that had filled his voice earlier was gone. He apologized. Elias listened. Then he told Gideon that an apology could not erase what had happened, but it could become the beginning of something better if it was followed by genuine change. The deal was temporarily suspended. Elias replaced the compromised financial team, ordered an independent audit, and insisted that every employee involved in the partnership receive transparent information about the restructuring. He also made one unexpected request: Mara should be offered a permanent position in the company's executive operations department because of the professionalism she had shown throughout the chaotic event. Months later, the billion-dollar agreement was finally completed under completely different conditions. Gideon remained involved only after accepting strict oversight and publicly acknowledging the mistakes that had nearly destroyed the partnership. And Elias? He continued arriving at work without an entourage. He still wore simple suits. He still spoke politely to receptionists and security guards. He still stopped to help people when they dropped papers. Because the afternoon had reminded him of something his late father had taught him years earlier: money could tell you what someone owned, but kindness revealed who they were. 1 year after the incident, the Grand Meridian Hotel hosted another business gathering. This time, Elias stood on the same stage before hundreds of guests. Beside him stood Mara, now a respected executive within the company. Before the ceremony began, Elias looked toward the audience and smiled. Nobody laughed at his simple suit anymore. Nobody wondered whether he belonged. Everyone knew exactly who he was. But Elias had never needed them to know. He had only wanted them to understand one thing: never measure a person's value by what they appear to possess, because sometimes the quietest person in the room is carrying the future in their hands. If this story touched your heart, please like the video, share it with someone who believes in treating every person with dignity, and subscribe to Kindness Corner 2.0 for more emotional stories about kindness, courage, and second chances. And before you go, comment, "Respect everyone," if you believe true success begins with kindness. Because Elias didn't win that day because he owned a billion-dollar deal. He won because, even when the entire room had the chance to embarrass him, he chose not to become the kind of person who had embarrassed him. And sometimes, that is the greatest victory of all.